A journey into one's past can be an exciting adventure when looking back over 100 years to meet the family. When one gets this kind of ambition, it becomes almost obsessive to delve into the mission and actually find the place where many generations back, a part of one's being held a place on this earth as their own. It was just this dream that began to consume me several years ago while talking about our family with the sister of my deceased maternal grandfather, my great-aunt, Margaret Reeves Hartberg. She later sent me a scrapbook full of photos and notes that ultimately answered many of my questions about my great-grandparents, who were her parents, Ben and Julia Reeves, and the ranches in Idaho that they built, lived, and worked on for over 50 years. A woman of very few words, Aunt Margaret, now in her mid-80s, holds deep in her memory her own recollections of the ranches and her life there as a child growing up. The more I learned from her, and the more I saw in the photos she had kept and stories that she had written down, the more I wanted to find my way there and actually see for myself the place that she once called home to Ben and Ole's land. Even though it had been over 60 years since she had last been there herself, she remembered it as though it were yesterday. I became so intrigued with the picture she drew in my mind of what the ranches looked like and the land they were on, I told her that someday I would like to see them for myself. Shaking her head, it was then she told me that the ranches were now in the hands of the Idaho Fish and Game Department, and it was very unlikely that I would be able to get onto the property through the gates that were locked, providing I could even get there, as they were both in very remote locations, miles from civilization and off of passable roads, accessible only by four-wheel drive or a small fixed-wing aircraft, or to pack in on horseback. The challenge was on. I knew from that moment on that I would go and see these places, whatever it took to get me there. It was the next winter that I met Ken Hartz from Stanley, Idaho. He had just sat through one of my performances at a festival in Sierra Vista, Arizona, and heard me tell the story of how my great-grandfather had come across the country as a child with his parents and 4 other siblings in a covered wagon, making their way from Missouri to the Grand Ronde Valley of Oregon in the 1860s. I went on to say that he eventually settled and ranched in Idaho near Lewiston, and that his ranches were still standing, and I was on a mission to get there and see them. Ken later introduced me to his wife, Bernie, who worked for the Forest Service in Stanley, Idaho, and he explained to her what I was looking for, and she did some research on her own and later sent me contact information for Sam McNeil of the Fish and Game Department in Lewiston, Idaho. I gave Sam a call early the next spring and introduced myself and told him he was recommended as the one to ask about the location of the Wapshilla Creek and the Deer Creek ranches, which were the ranches owned by my great-grandparents. I then learned that they were situated on the old Nez Perce County lines in the Craig Mountain Wilderness area. He told me that the Idaho Fish and Game Department did in fact own the lands and buildings, and that they had been turned into administrative sites, with a caretaker living at one and maintaining the property. My heart began to pound as I realized that all I had to do was ask if there was any way I could get onto the properties and into the houses and into the barns, and before I knew it, a date had been set for mid-June 2004 to meet Sam in Lewiston, and he would gladly take me to the Winter Range Ranch at Wapshilla Creek in his four-wheel drive for a day-long journey to glimpse my past. At the time of his death, at the age of 82 in 1940, Benjamin Reeves was one of the last few cattle trailers of the Old West. As a young man, he was a trail boss for an outfit out of Texas where he was in charge of trailing thousands of head of cattle annually to the Kansas City market, requiring several months of riding through harsh climatic conditions and raids on the stock. It was claimed that he always delivered his stock to his destination, no matter the obstacles. He later rode for the government, gathering wild horses in eastern Oregon. It was here he earned his nickname of Oregon Ben. In 1884, he moved to the Craig Mountain area where he engaged in his own cattle business with headquarters in Lewiston. In 1901, he met and married young Julia Nelson, whose family had also come by wagon train from the Red River Valley of North Dakota to the town of Forest, near Lewiston, in the late 1880s. Ben and Julia, whom he fondly nicknamed Ole, lived the rest of their years together at Wapshilla Creek Ranch, where they had their children, and the Deer Creek Ranch, raising fine herds of livestock that historically always commanded top prices at eastern and western markets. In their day, the Reeves ranches were considered one of the largest operations in the livestock industry in the West. An appreciator of fine cigars, Ben's death was attributed to cancer of the lung. Overcome with weakness from his illness, it wasn't until just a couple of months before he passed away that he finally consented to give up the hard physical labor of work on the rangelands he possessed between the Snake and Salmon rivers. With the help of ranch hands Mr. Prettywood and Elmer Magnetti, Julia continued to maintain the ranches and the livestock business until 1946, when she sold out to a buyer for $6 an acre. She retired in Lewiston and resided there until her own death on New Year's Day, 1970. Hours before his demise on September 8, 1940, and still passionate about the day-to-day business of the ranch, Ben whispered softly to Ole, "How's the stock?"
On the side of a mountain in northern Idaho, in a pasture of grass, sits a barn and a home, with a view of the valley where the Salmon River runs. This land has weathered endless years of harsh wind and sun. The old barn made of wood has stood 100 years and more, with a roof made of tin that's all tattered and torn. The wind whistles through the timbers with a haunting, mournful sound. What used to shelter livestock slowly topples to the ground. The house still sits solid on foundation made of stone. The old porch still has a swinging wooden door. For two pioneers, this was the place they made their home. You can almost hear their footsteps walking o'er the hardwood floor. A cowboy tall and handsome they called Oregon Ben met the daughter of a judge, and soon they were wed. His bride he called Ole, was pretty and real smart. He loved that young girl with all of his heart. Though the years lay long wood corrals long empty of the livestock it once held. Their spirits still remain as I walk upon this ground. I have seen it with my eyes, I have touched it with my hands, I have walked across the ground of this place that is grand. Their voices whisper in the wind as they welcome me in. I have stood upon the ground of Ben and Ole's land. These are the treasures I have found on Ben and Ole's land.